You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Successful Screenwriter Podcast, where we discuss anything and everything screenwriting. Here we interview successful screenwriters and filmmakers to find out just what it takes to make it in the industry. Just a heads up, this episode is brought to you by my book, The Guide for Every Screenwriter, which has been listed as one of the best screenwriting books of all time by the Book Authority. If you're looking for something that reveals the secrets of screenwriting in an easy to understand and engaging way, then this is the book for you. You can find The Guide for Every Screenwriter at thesuccessfulscreenwriter.com/books. Now, on to the show. All right, welcome to the podcast. I have an awesome guest on today. This is author and filmmaker Jeffrey Michale Bays, who has written the book Suspense with a Camera, where he analyzes the Hitchcockian film technique. Jeffrey, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
This is exciting. I don't really get to talk about the suspense and thriller genres often. I actually enjoy writing in that genre, so it's nice to kind of have an expert like yourself discuss it, especially from, the Hitchcockian point of view, because he was so groundbreaking in his techniques.
That's true. He was groundbreaking. And I should point out that suspense is not just a genre, because all stories, no matter what kind of stories they are, in fact, romantic comedies can actually be suspenseful as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Just want to throw that out there because I face that confusion quite often.
No, I appreciate that.
Or that assumption. Yeah.
No, it's very true. You can build suspense into any scene to help keep the pace of the script as well. Like you said, it can be with comedy, and it's just a slightly different approach. So let's get your origin story. What brought you to the point of writing this book? And then we're going to kind of talk about the process of filmmaking and writing and with suspense.
Okay, well, I guess it all started when I was 15. I watched a Hitchcock movie, Rear Window.
Oh, yeah.
And I wasn't expecting much, at that age. I was just thinking, oh, this is going to be, one of those boring old movies, which I think that's probably the standard response that most 15-year-olds would have.
Yeah, of course.
And as it started, I felt like I was right. This is a boring old movie. But as it went on, I started to notice, there's something pulling me into this. This is interesting. I started to feel this kind of hyper presence in the moment that I had never felt with another movie quite this way before. And so that caught my attention. I really enjoyed the movie after that. And I started, that's kind of started my interest in what was this thing that Hitchcock was doing that nobody else was doing? How did he do that? So that's kind of where I started with the curiosity, and then, several decades later, I guess.
Yeah, and you actually created your own film that was full of suspense, where you got to use these different techniques as well, didn't you?
Yeah, that's true. Offing David was the feature that I directed in Australia, actually. Funny story about that. I was actually attacked by a bird in a park.
That's funny.
While filming that movie. So I've kind of felt like that was Hitchcock's presence, kind of welcoming that film. That was early on. that was my first feature. So I was kind of obsessed with this interview book that Francois Truffaut did with Alfred Hitchcock in the 1960s. So I had a copy of that, and I was reading it constantly, just trying to find little kind of insights or tips and tricks, because somebody, I think, gave that book to me as a gift or something. So I'm like, this is, well, it takes a long time to read. So, so I was constantly reading it. And so I kind of made little notes and checklists and things. So by the time I started directing this film, I was trying to put those techniques into practice, which it's kind of a tough thing to do, as it turns out.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and some things work, some things don't work. as you find out in the directing, if you've ever directed a film. And I, in writing this book, I talked to a lot of editors, like the editor of Born Identity, Sarah Klein. He said most of that movie was created in the editing room.
Wow.
They didn't know if it was actually going to work as they were filming it, and apparently that's quite common for a
Oh, how
suspense
about
film.
that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, editing, I've had a few episodes where we've spoken with editors and they talk about, that's really, you write a movie, you shoot a movie, you edit the movie, you make the movie 3 times. And so I can absolutely see where you're coming from there. In the book, you talked about something I thought was really interesting. You talk about the Triad of Secrets. And I was wondering if you could kind of take us through that a little bit.
Well, that's the most important thing to think about as a writer. And this is something I didn't realize as I was directing Offing David. I think I sort of had an instinct for it. I think we all have that sort of instinct, but we don't really kind of consciously, calculate
Right.
every moment of the script. Who knows what is basically what that is saying. So if you divide things up into the protagonist and the antagonist and all the other characters kind of mixed in, and then the audience, what does the audience know at every point? And so what the triad does is it separates those into 3. And so you figure out, okay, is this a secret that the protagonist knows, and then the audience also knows that, but the other characters don't know it? So in that way, you can start to set up your suspense with that secret almost getting out to those other characters.
Right. And setting up, potential for conflict there.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, in the Hitchcockian way of doing it, those other characters are either incompetent or just kind of dumb, and they are capable of figuring out the secret, but for some reason they don't.
It just eludes them. Yeah.
Right. And so that kind of teases the audience as they dance closer to kind of bumbling into this secret. That's where the suspense comes from in Hitchcock, and that's why his films are so fun, because he's really playing with the audience at every step of the way.
I think that's really awesome, and actually became part of his brand too, wasn't it? That he would, and I think you mentioned this in your book, that he would show up in a film, usually before a big scene. He would somehow be in the background or something.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, he started out with his cameos early on, and probably a part of his marketing strategy, because he was in marketing before he became a director.
Okay.
So I think he was always thinking about that and how to get his name in the papers. And so he drew his silhouette, that you still recognize today.
Right.
And it's almost as recognizable as the McDonald's arches,
Amazing.
So yeah, branding early on was a big deal for him. So anytime that he would get newspapers or audiences to think about him as the director, that was part of his strategy. Because if you're going into a film thinking about him along with the characters, then you're automatically entered into this kind of cat and mouse game with the director.
Yeah. He was building a personal relationship with his audience, which is really fascinating. I mean, it's something that I see reflected in like an M. Night Shyamalan. He has kind of built up this brand and built up his relationship with the audience. And it's kind of almost counterintuitive, considering how most directors are trying to prop up the talent. They're trying to show, look at the big star we have. And it's totally the opposite. If you go to see a Hitchcock film, you're seeing a Hitchcock film. So I think it's really actually quite brilliant when it comes to branding yourself as a director.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's also very hard to do in today's world.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Trying to stand up from the crowd. I mean, even as a writer, you really have to get out there and make sure you find a unique niche for your brand and then just pound it into the ground. So you have a really cool chapter in here, writing a visual sentence. And I think that is so important because it's something that a lot of screenwriters will not get the first couple of rounds when they get into screenwriting. They think, oh, I just write this script and then I'll use all of the camera directions and it's fine. And they have to come into their growth as a writer to learn how to paint a scene visually with the written word to trigger that theater of the mind and get somebody lost in a script. I'm really glad to see you have a chapter on that. I was wondering if you could walk us through your methodology in writing a visual sentence.
Sure. It actually is a couple of chapters, I think, that goes
Great.
through that. And this was the mistake I made in my feature film, Offing David. When you're at the script phase, a lot of writers focus on dialogue.
Yeah.
It's all about talking. And as it turns out, when you're directing, dialogue really isn't all that important. And if it is, you're doing it wrong. Because when it comes to the visual language of film, which was created back in the silent film era, because we didn't have sound, we didn't have dialogue. So they had to create ways to tell the story. They figured out early on that you can use editing and sequencing shots together to convey ideas and to build ideas that you can't necessarily do in a single shot. And so the basic kind of construction is that you have all of these elements, which I call words in the visual sentence.
Yeah.
Like eyes, hands, feet, and objects. And so you find those elements of your story and you find ways to tell the story through hands, feet, and objects, and of course, eyes.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah. So the eyes are the most important thing, obviously, because of the actor connecting with the audience. So the basic structure is that you show an actor looking to something. He sees something. That's step one. Then you cut to what he's looking at. And that's number two. And then three is that you cut back to his reaction shot as he's processing what he is looking at.
Yeah.
So in that way, you are involving the audience in his thought process without any dialogue. And you can continue that. You can continue to cut to new things that he is seeing. In fact, the entire film of Rear Window is mostly created this way. He looks out the window, he sees something, and then he wonders what he's seeing, and builds conspiracy theories about that.
Right. Yeah, I think Rear Window, I think, has been remade a few times because it's that strong of a concept and cheap to make. So I think those two together make it that kind of that contained thriller exciting for an audience, because you just don't know what's happening, and you end up guessing as well. You end up guessing about what's going on, just like the central character does. So you're literally going through that journey with them. In Rear Window, we don't have more information than the character does, right? So that's kind of the fun, exciting aspect of that type of a thriller.
Right. And of course, film is reaction shots. A lot of emotional information is contained in the reaction shot. So if you're in a situation with somebody and something weird happens, what do? You look to that next person to see what their reaction is. That's exactly what you're doing. Yeah.
No, I think that's awesome. It's actually funny you say that, because you play around with that. People are so funny psychologically. If you're in a room with somebody and you want to see if one person has a crush on the other person, make them laugh and then see who they look to first, and that's an insight into their mind on who they love. And types of things like that come into all kinds of scenarios, especially with suspense. You're going to look at the person you're most worried about. So I think that's really fascinating that you can use that type of a reaction shot to manipulate an audience's emotions. You talk a lot about clarity with tension and laughs, and I think this is so important, especially when it comes to suspense. But in writing in general, I mean, I've looked at like a Tarantino, who can go grindhouse, he can go gritty, he can go dark, he can go splatter. It doesn't matter what he does, he always balances that out with a comedic, lighthearted flair. It's something that I do in my own work, and it kind of provides that emotional roller coaster for an audience, for a reader. I just want to get your take on that.
Sure. And Coen Brothers, also another good example of that. I think what Hitchcock discovered is that comedy is the way to make scary stuff and maybe kind of heavy kind of horror, make it more fun for the audience, to make it
Yeah.
easier to watch. And I think that comes back from, he was influenced by British plays, which at the time were very much kind of comedy mysteries.
Okay.
So his sense of humor was always there because of the British influence. But I think he found that if you stretch out the suspense for a long time and the tension along with that, the audience can really get bored with that if it's not
Right.
relieved in some way. So
Right.
that if you think about it like a roller coaster, you go up and down in a roller coaster. Imagine a roller coaster that's just one drop and that's it. I've actually been on one of those, by the way. Not quite as fun as
Yeah, that sounds
as
terrible.
going up and down and around. Yeah, so you really want to vary the rhythm of that tension, and the best way to do that for the audience is to laugh at something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing I find is that they'll either set it up as a lighter moment right before we get into a dark moment, or they'll follow it up shortly after the dark moment as a tension break. So it's usually somewhere within that, I guess you would say, that roller coaster track is where I find it falling.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So
And
go ahead.
in some cases in Hitchcock, it's during the moments of
Ooh.
suspense. In that, I'm thinking right now of Strangers on a Train, the murder scene in that movie,
Oh yeah.
in which a girl is being murdered in a park, and in the background you hear this happy carnival music. So in that way, he's
It's
inserting
irony.
humor.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much irony to contrast with that situation.
Yeah.
So that the audience doesn't really know, should I be laughing, or
Right.
isn't it weird that they're all happy about, and they don't know what's going on. They don't know what the seriousness that is happening right around the corner. And that's really a great way to
yeah, it's fascinating
Yeah.
just listening to how he could manipulate an audience like in a musical, or in a, it's just he could just play the tune just right to keep you on edge and to mess with you. And I think I know with my writing I try and do that, and it is fun. It is fun to sit there and put somebody on this kind of a journey, especially if you get the reaction you're hoping for. And
the best way, sorry, go ahead.
please, by all means.
I was going to say, to tie back to the characters that don't know what's going on, making them funny is also a great way to insert the humor, because
Sure.
if the more ridiculous they are in their kind of bumbling stupidity, not seeing what everybody else is seeing, what the audience is seeing, that's a great way to put humor into the situation.
It really is. And that's a fine line there, because you don't want to have a character who is such a bumbling idiot that you're wanting them to die. You want to have some kind of an empathetic feel towards them, to where the audience is invested, so that their death has impact and power. So, I mean, that is such a fine line to walk, but I think you're absolutely right. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to break down films and really find out where the plot points fall. And I am really wimpy when it comes to scary movies. So what I have to do now is I have to turn the sound all the way off, because the music will give me like a panic attack, because it builds so well into the anticipation of suspense, right? Because it's not the monster itself we're worried about. It's the walking down the hallway towards the monster. I mean, that's the one big Hitchcock thing. So how much, I mean, as a filmmaker, how much do you really consider music when you're out there and you're writing that script? Is that something that you've got an idea of, this is a scene, I'm going to play it out, and then I'll have music in there that really build this up? Or is this kind of an after the fact thing, kind of like with the editing?
Well, I think it's kind of the opposite in that when you're writing, you think, well, this should be a silent scene. This should not have music.
Okay.
Um, in fact, that's one misconception a lot of people have about suspense and tension is that music can help it in, and oftentimes it takes away from the tension. When you have a really good suspense setup, the audience feels like they're actually there live in the moment. And along with that comes all the sounds that are in the space. And those sounds can be dramatically used to make things more tense.
Yeah.
For instance, the footsteps coming up the stairs.
Hmm.
If there's music there, that kind of takes you out of that space and into a more kind of emotional kind
That
of
makes sense.
above the scene rather than
Yeah.
actually experiencing it live. So you're kind of taking away from that experience. And it depends because like with Hitchcock, he on the Psycho shower scene, he did not want music in that scene
Right.
for that reason. But then I think once he heard the music, he was convinced, yeah, that actually does work.
It was a
But
powerful, yeah, that was a powerful
yeah,
score. But I can see what you're talking about, like those steps up the stairs. If you have a really loud and obnoxious soundtrack at that point, it's pulling you out of it so that you realize you're watching a movie, which is what we don't
yeah,
want. We want to feel like we're in the movie. So I totally get what you're saying. And I think it's
exactly.
awesome to take that angle of, okay, let's write from a point of, okay, which scene should be silent, which scene is going to pull them in. Um,
And then the
Jeffrey,
music would come in after that, so that when you're processing what has just happened, that's when the music comes in.
oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have?
Well, I don't know. This is your show. It's your podcast. Um, the one thing I would emphasize is the 3 steps to creating suspense. I think we kind of touched on a few elements of it, but that's always a big one. Would you like to go through that quickly?
Absolutely.
Did I lose you? Oh, okay. You just
I was building the suspense in. See?
yes. Yeah. Okay. So 3 steps of suspense. So in order to do this in your script, what you need to do first is to find out if there is something that can be a secret that you can use for suspense. Now, one time I was working on a script and couldn't figure out what to use for suspense. And what happened in the story is that this man quits his job. He resigns at the very last point in the movie, kind of a surprise for everybody. So decided that to build suspense, you would use that throughout the film, that he wants to quit, but he can't. So he actually goes to his boss to quit, and then he gets nervous. He has a letter of resignation, and he can't give it to his boss because he's too afraid. So that letter becomes the suspense object that comes up throughout the film as he's carrying it to the building, and later as he actually does mail it to his boss.
Cool.
So you want to find something physical that exists in the story world to kind of be a secret. And so what you do is the protagonist knows about the secret, but nobody else in the story knows about it. And you set up the fact that if it gets out, it's going to change things. It's going to be a big deal.
Right.
And so the first thing you do is you make person A lie to person B about that. And so that kind of, that involves the audience. When the audience sees the protagonist lie to somebody, that gets their attention, and they're like, oh, he just lied about that. And that kind of brings them in.
Right.
So then once you establish that empathy and that secret, then it's all about building in these close calls where the secret almost gets out. So that's where your suspense comes in, so that you can have as many of these as you want throughout your film, or you could just do one and that's it. But the key is that the secret does not get out at the end of the close call scene, so that it's a tease for the audience. It gets really close to coming out, but then it doesn't. And what that does, it's like in the gambling world, there's a thing called the near miss effect, where the gambler almost wins, and then he feels like he's on a winning streak.
Okay.
Because the next time he's getting closer and closer to winning. And it's the same way and he becomes more addicted to gambling because of that. It's the same way for the audience in the suspense film, is that they get addicted to watching your movie.
I love that.
And soap operas do this really well. They've figured this out a long time ago.
They're chock full of secrets.
Yeah. Like, somebody's pregnant. They don't want that information out. So, affairs and things like that. Any of these kinds of things can be secrets in your story.
I love the suspense object. To me, it feels like a thriller MacGuffin, and I think it's a great story tool to use. And you can use and build these secrets into anything. It's pretty awesome. Well, thank you for that. The book is Suspense with a Camera, Jeffrey Michale Bays. Is there anywhere that people can find you online? Do you have a website or anything like that?
I do have a website, borgus.com, borgus.com, and I'm also on Twitter at borgusfilm. And
fantastic.
And you can find me on YouTube as well, where I have lots of free stuff for filmmakers and writers to look at.
Hey, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter by using my handle at ScreenwriterPod. And if you liked the show, please support it by subscribing and sharing the episode on your social media.